but I know where you live. Nuskeptix presents the Christ myth theory with #1 author David Fitzgerald and the religiously literate historical researcher Neil Godfrey of Vridar. Nuskeptix is a humanist organization promoting biblical and scientific literacy. We facilitate the global religious discussion and especially support the work of Christ myth theory authors Richard Carrier, Robert M. Price, Raphael Lataster, David Fitzgerald, and Neil Godfrey, who are on our show today. So, gentlemen, welcome to Nuskeptix.
Good.
All right. Let's see. We are on YouTube with interviews and expert discussions, and on Facebook and Google Plus with Christian Mythology Hangouts. We've got pages and discussion groups that you can join. This is the first in a series of Nuskeptix events examining the Christ myth theory. We're happy to welcome back David Fitzgerald and Neil Godfrey. Welcome, David. I think he's.
Oh, I've got my mic muted. Let's try that again. Thanks, back. Thanks, Bill.
Okay, thanks, Dave. That was really, really loud. Okay. Well, how's things going out there on the West Coast? Same-sex marriage passed.
It sure did, which is a big deal here in San Francisco.
Most certainly. And let me bring in Neil. This is Neil Godfrey, a writer for Vridar magazine, along with Tim Widowfield, and it is just a great source of Christian origin information, Christ myth theory. I've been reading it about 4 years, I think. So welcome, Neil.
Thank you, Phil. Just one point though. We pronounce it Vridar.
Ah, okay. Well, that's good. It reminds me of when I kept calling Faisal Mutar a Faisal, but that's because when I was growing up, we had King Faisal in Jordan or someplace, and it stuck in my brain.
Yeah.
All right. Well, okay.
Yeah,
now,
comes through a book.
What do you think of American politics, Neil?
We do try to ignore it.
That's a loaded question.
No, well, it's all the. I am sort of half aware of much of it just through my RSS feeds on the web, but I don't think too many Australians are really following the same sort of, all the ins and outs of the primaries, anything like that. It's bad enough. Our own government is moving more towards a Tea Party stance, and that's bad enough for us.
Right. And well, Dave, does Bernie Sanders represent a new tolerance for skeptics, or is America still no country for old atheists?
Oh, that's a great question. Personally, I freaking love Bernie Sanders. I would love to see him run for president, and I would love it if the race was actually between Hillary and Bernie. That's the kind of political spectrum I'd like to see in this country.
Exactly, Dave. I'm very European influenced, apparently, but and that's what Bernie is, old style socialist European, really, and they've done some great things for their people. So, do you think that Bill is too old for Hillary to win the presidency?
Oh, I don't even know if we need to factor the Bill factor in at all as far as Hillary's concerned. If he's involved in her presidency, it's just kind of like having a bonus president, as far as I'm concerned.
I see. Okay. Well, how about Neil's nomination? And I think that was with Tim for a religious literacy award.
I was very happy to promote that out because Vridar is one of my favorite all-time blogs. I posted, I think, 3 things from it today. Just today. It's amazing. I love it. I think I remember reading recently, and Neil, you can back me up on this or correct me. It's named after Vardis Fisher's series. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. He had a series of novels called The Testament of Man. He explored human evolution, really, from primitive Stone Age right through to his own life. It was biographical in a sense, biographical fiction, and he used pseudonyms, throughout. And Vridar was his name in his final, more autobiographical two-set volume, and I identify with so much of his progress from a Mormon. He grew up as a Mormon. He understood what it's like to be a part of a religious cult like that, and then he moved into finding out what the real world is like, with education and becoming an atheist. He went his personal issues too, with relationships, women, marriage, and all that. That all gelled a lot with me as well. So I just felt a real affinity with his character, his fictional character, Vridar.
Huh. I would love to see his books become more widely available. They're very hard to find now these days. But that Old Testament man series.
It took me a while to get them through secondhand stores all around the world, really. I got them from everywhere. Here locally in Australia, US, UK. So.
It's funny, though. Before I heard that was the case, I always thought Vridar stood for something like veracity radar, that you were like truth radar.
Not bad.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, Dave, how about your coming book?
The coming book I'm working on as we speak is called Jesus Mything in Action. It's the follow-up book to Nailed. Nailed, as you know, is the 10 Christian myths that just don't pass the reality check and suggest to me very strongly that Jesus didn't exist at all. In the new book, Jesus Mything in Action, I wanted to take on all the arguments that I heard from atheist critics of Nailed, who tried to tell me that, oh no, it's crazy to think there was at least a guy named Jesus. When everything that, it wouldn't bother me if there was a real Jesus. There's nothing implausible about the idea that there was a real guy named Jesus. It's just when I look at the evidence, everything points in the opposite direction. And so my main purpose in this new book is not to turn everybody into Jesus atheists, but turn them into Jesus agnostics. In fact, I want to turn them into militant Jesus agnostics. So, do you think there's a Jesus, or you think there was a really Jesus? They'll say, I don't know, and neither do you.
Right. Well, yeah, it seems to me, Jesus being an allegory for the Yom Kippur atonement ritual, it seems a bit strange to me to look for a real person that happened to be there in history to be the ritual.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just that. I mean, it's very clear from that point that that's an allegory. But in the new book, I'm going from the very beginning of Mark all the way to the very end and trying to demonstrate that the whole thing is an allegory from start to finish. Whether there was a real Jesus or not, like Robert Price says, for all extents and purposes, there's not one anymore, because everything we know about Jesus comes from these 4 Gospels that don't seem to be based on any actual living human being at all.
Right. Okay. So, let me see now. We've talked about Vridar. And, here it is. Indeed. Okay, I want to ask you gentlemen, if you had to list top 3 reasons for doubting the historical Jesus, wouldn't that begin somewhere with the fact that we don't have the documents that a historian would even use?
You want to start first, Neil, or shall I?
Go right ahead.
Well, okay. I really don't see reasons. I don't have really a top 3 list. My approach is simply to ask how we know anything about the past. And when someone says, Jesus existed, here it is in the Bible, well, you simply say, well, how do we know that's true? They then look at something else, another Josephus, and you say, well, what about this? And there's simply nothing there. It's not as though you're looking at Julius Caesar or some other person, or Socrates from ancient history. It's my approach is simply ask, well, how do you know? It's the same, really, same idea with anything, any information that comes your way. We always ask for the source.
Right.
And if it's not there, they can't back it up. Why accept it? I'm not saying that doesn't prove there was no Jesus, but I just simply don't see it as an issue to embrace.
Yeah. what Neil just said, and on top of that, it's whenever anyone like Reza Aslan or Bart Ehrman or who, fill in the blank, because there's so many different secular Jesuses proposed by secular scholars. Whatever you think Jesus said or did, it's like Neil said, the first thing you have to ask is what's our source for that? And in the case of Jesus, we just don't have anything to hang a hat on that sticks.
Right. Not even a third-hand account and no independent accounts.
And in fact, it's worse than that. It's even worse than that because what we do have all points to the fact that this was some kind of Jewish take on mystery faiths at the time, and that there were many of them competing with each other, and that none of them seemed to have a leg on any of the others. And the whole thing stayed this on the fringe society. It took hundreds of years for it to even rise to the level of minor Roman deities and cults. And, well, as I said, nailed, there's a primary paradox for me at the very core that it all boils down to, and that's it. Either Jesus said these amazing things, taught these amazing things, or did these miracles, and no one noticed his whole life for almost 100 years, no one outside his cult, or he didn't do these things, and yet as soon as he's dead, we have all these feuding house cults that aren't just in Judea and the Galilee, but I mean they're scattered all over the Roman Empire, and they can't agree about the first thing, about who he was, what he taught, and who his friends and family were.
Yes. Okay, we have quite a cacophony of cults there in the 2nd century that we find with Valentinians and, right?
Yep, yeah. Theodosians, you name it, all kinds.
Can I just say one thing there? If we take the first, what's generally recognised as the first gospel, or really any of the earlier gospels, all of the stories of Jesus have been, we can demonstrate that they are really adaptations of various interpretations of the Old Testament stories or some other story. It's just the way they're written in a midrashic type style, not midrash as such, but intertextual. See, John the Baptist is really woven to get through Elijah stories and various prophecies. They're simply, and then when you come to the later Gospels like Luke, he says he's relying on vague sources, but he never identifies them. This is very unusual for an ancient document. Ancient historians or people who wanted to present, the facts or pass on information, almost always, explain what their sources were and what their authority was, who they were, and we don't find that in the.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh.
But I just want to dovetail into that, and even because sometimes apologists will push back and say, "Oh, well, it's chauvinistic of us to expect ancient historians to live up to our modern standards," but ancient historians expected ancient historians to live up to their standards, not our standard. It was their standard too, and we have a whole range of different ancient historians who were good and who were not so good. And Luke is the only one who even claims to be writing a history in the Gospels. And he's clearly not living up to any of the standards they set.
Right, and in fact, we're gonna open up some more of that a bit as we go. We'll be looking into Luke, and it seems to me Jesus, they were almost like hanging ornaments on a Christmas tree when they were writing that thing, because it seems like they grabbed a bit of Osiris and a bit of Dionysus and this and that to dress Jesus with.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I see those. Yeah, when you bring in the Egyptian religion, I don't know that we have any evidence that there was a direct influence, but certainly that what the Isis and Osiris myths show is what the mythical ideas were at that time, what people accepted as conceivable in stories, narratives, origins, and so on, and that's part of the world they grow up in and write in, and so it's natural there would be some influences there.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, John, let me ask you about this, Dave, because you have the Epiphany of St. Paul, and in that they're robbing the Bacchae, as Robert Price has shown, for the dialogue between the god and the person who is going against the god, and Dionysus is the god of Epiphany. Okay, so to me that seems a bit too convenient that he's there, and certainly any educated person would have known what they were talking about.
Well, this is the thing. This is the thing. People say, "Oh, was it a conspiracy?" No, it wasn't a conspiracy. Whoever wrote the Gospel of Mark, he expected his more intelligent readers, or I shouldn't say more intelligent, but his more sophisticated readers, to know exactly what he was doing. It was very common for these mystery faiths to have like this split level of here's the story, but the story is an allegory for these spiritual truths over here. And we see that in Judaism, we see that in early Christianity, we see that in all the mystery faiths.
Excellent point. Okay, what do we think about Carrier's celestial Jesus?
Well, I don't have to tell you, I'm a huge Carrier fan. Earl Doherty, Price, and Carrier, when they talk about Paul's Jesus being a mythological figure, and not just Paul, but all the early Christians before the Gospels are written, I don't see how you can argue against that, to be honest with you. I mean, he even says that his Lord's Supper, this is our Lord's Supper. Don't confuse it with their Lord's Supper. That's the cup of demons. You know, this is ours. There's many lords and there's many saviors, but for us there's just one, Jesus. And he even uses mystery faith terminology. It's just, yeah, it's slam dunk to me.
Yeah. There's another author who writes about Paul's efforts converting or establishing churches in Greece. I don't know how to pronounce the name. Hanges is his surname. Hangers. But no, he does draw. He's certainly not a mythicist, but he does draw a lot of parallels with Paul's efforts and the mystery religions. Yeah, you've got someone coming in, doing strange things, attracting attention with tongues or miracles of some sort, and then setting up people in positions, having them given all different gifts within their closed structure. Yeah, no, it's very similar to the mystery religions, and he's drawing. Yeah, this is a secular scholar. You said not a mythicist, and it's very clear.
You know what's funny about that too, Neil, is over and over again as I'm researching for the new book, I come across scholars, mostly secular scholars, who aren't mythicists, and yet they keep uncovering things that are pure props to the mythicist case. And they stop short of saying, well, of course there was a Jesus, but it's interesting how blah, 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 how this, and I see that over and over and over again. And it's like when they talk about us mythicists being on the outside and the periphery and we're pariahs, most of what we're saying isn't controversial at all. Most of what we're saying is part of the majority opinion. It's that tip of the iceberg where we just push the ramifications to their logical conclusion. That's what makes us radical, if we're going to use that term.
Exactly. Now, when I started Vridar,
let's return.
I was posting a lot of those articles, about that sort of scholarship, and a number of well-known scholars who now in the biblioblogs and so on contributed and commented very favourably. But once they discovered I was partial towards mythicism, boom, out they went. And shut the doors.
Okay,
but I was saying things.
All right, now back to the Bible. In the theater in Rome, the gods were a regular presence. Could Jesus have been a theater character at one time?
I mean, certainly Robinson believed that when he looked at Jesus praying in Gethsemane and said, well, who would hear him say this? There's nobody there to record his words. And he was saying this whole thing is some kind of theological drama, some passion play kind of a thing. Maybe. For me,
in other words, it could be a parody of the Attis cult.
Say that again.
Pardon me. Could we be seeing a parody of the Attis cult type passion plays?
I mean, my gut feeling, and this is just my gut feeling, is just from what we see, it seems like there were many sources for early Christianity, and most of what we call Christianity came from these Jewish intellectuals who were trying to blend a Jewish version of the mystery faiths. So could there be a theatrical aspect of that? Sure. Could it have been all literary? Sure. Maybe there was many of these attempts. I mean, the fact is we just know the tip of our iceberg, but there's so much more going on behind the scenes that we'll never know. We only just see hints of it here and there. in my humble opinion.
Okay, now maybe we can bring Neil in a bit more to talk about whether the Christians in Rome invented their own history with Luke Acts, or what?
I have suspicions. I can't prove anything, but there was one scholar, Marianne Bonds, who did publish that very possibility. She was trying. She saw overlaps between the Book of Acts and Virgil's Aeneid. Virgil's Aeneid was the mythical story of the founding of Rome. Aeneas fleeing the Trojan war, and the Troy fell, and then going through various adventures across the sea and establishing a new settlement in Rome. And on the way, he got sidetracked in Carthage for a while. And she sees similarities there. And since then, Dennis MacDonald has also written along a similar theme, but I haven't had a chance to read his argument about it yet. Marion Bonds' argument was very short on specifics. It was more of a general idea. I'm hoping Dennis MacDonald does give more specific hints that is the case. I had a look at it myself, and I'm intrigued by the idea. I don't know, but it's an intriguing idea, especially when Paul leaves Troas. His initial voyage to Rome started at Troas, which is Troy, the modern Troy. It goes through Jerusalem, suffers, near end of the mission there, as Aeneas did at Carthage, and then setting up a new Jerusalem, or a new spiritual empire or spiritual church in Rome. The parallels are intriguing.
Huh. That does sound very interesting. How does
follow-up to that, Phil, before we go and leave Luke? One interesting thing that Rick Carey has brought up, and other scholars before him, that if there are some traces of actual historical sources in Luke, even they point to the fact that Jesus was a myth. Because, for instance, in all the trial transcripts of like Peter and Paul and Stephen in there, whenever they talk about Christ, the Romans are scratching their heads saying, I don't know what this is. This is some obscure Jewish thing. They're not talking about a guy who they just crucified, 40 days ago or less. That's not on their radar at all.
Right, and that fits with his being an allegory.
Absolutely.
The crucifixion. Yes. Okay. Well, then on to more about Luke. How does Luke relate to Marcion's gospel? Or is anyone up on that?
Good question. If we had Robert Price here, he could talk a lot more about that. I'm actually looking into that right now, so if you ask me a month from now, I'll have more intelligent things to say about it. Whether Luke was the source of Marcion's gospel, or whether Marcion was the source of Luke's gospel.
Okay, but we do know that Luke copied Josephus, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about that. The Acts is totally dependent on a book that Josephus wrote in 93 or 94 AD. There's just no two ways around that. And in fact, it's Luke's mistakes in copying from that book. That is one of the ways that we know that it's him copying Josephus and not Josephus copying him.
Okay. Now, Paul's epistles are the oldest writings about Jesus, yet he doesn't know about Jesus' teachings or miracles. Instead, Jesus communicates to him in visions. Now, if St. Paul was alive today, would he likely be wearing a tinfoil hat?
Neil?
I'm lost on the expression tinfoil hat. I'm very sorry.
Was he a nutter?
That's to stop the space race. That's to stop the space race from getting in. I'm wondering. Actually, it has been posited that he was schizotypal, a person who has hallucinations, but they don't have the paranoia, schizophrenia, that sort of thing.
It's easy to get not over Paul, but what we're reading in Paul is, I believe, a real hodgepodge of redactions, and I don't think we can take any one letter and say, well, gosh, that's really contradictory and weird there. I think the simple explanation is that we've seen redactions over time. It's not what we're reading there is not one person writing a letter from start to finish. We're seeing get redactions through those.
Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But what, Phil, I want to jump in there too. Another thing about when you're talking about Paul, everything that Paul tells us is very different from everything that Luke tells us about Paul. And one of the things that Paul never tells us is that he had this encounter on the road to Damascus. He never tells us anything remotely that spectacular or dramatic. Even though Luke likes the story so much, he tells it 3 times in 3 slightly different versions. But Paul, everything that he knows about Jesus seems to come from reading in the Scripture and revelations from Jesus directly to him.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, too, that the only scriptures Jesus would have recognized had he been a real person would have been the Hebrew Scriptures.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And other books that aren't even in the Jewish canon.
Yeah. And perhaps some of the non-canonical ones, like the Book of Enoch. Why not those, too?
Exactly. I was just going to bring up that very one. Yep, absolutely.
You're saying the Book of Enoch?
Right.
Yeah, there wasn't a volume, a bound volume saying, well, these are the books, this is it, at that time. There was some fluidity until much later.
Right. We're going to get into that as well, too. But is Jesus Osiris? He most mirrors the Osiris myth, I think.
I don't know. That seems like one of those cases where they're stretching it too far, in my opinion.
Okay, that's what I want to hear.
Gospel of John. Could I just say, it's Lazarus, Gospel of John. Randall Helms presents an interesting argument, for that. But how much of that is a literary adaptation? Whether or not they actually believed it as really taken from the I don't know. Because John also draws on the myth of Dionysus. I just wonder if in the Gospel of John, for example, there's an amalgamation of various myths trying to show that Jesus is superior to all of these myths.
There you go. That I would have no problem accepting, for sure.
Okay, Neil, while we're at you, how about Plato's effect on the Bible or philosophy generally? It seems we're hearing the Stoics, and it seems that Paul is the kind of guy you wouldn't invite to your party twice.
Well, yeah. Much of this goes back with the Old Testament, for example. I use the Old Testament, that's what I'm most familiar with. I know it's not politically correct, we're supposed to call it Hebrew Bible, but it depends so much on how we interpret the origins of that. I tend to favour the minimalists who see the Bible being written, or the Old Testament books being written, composed really in late Persian and Hellenistic times, very recently, only a few hundred years, 200-300 years before the Christian era. And I do lean to those arguments to see a lot of Hellenistic influence. The books of the Bible are adaptations or based on the ideas that they find in Plato. The Pentateuch, for example, is setting up an ideal state with God, and that comes very much out of Plato's laws. You can see so many parallels there. I'll be posting more about that in the next few months.
Those are his ideal laws, I think they were called, and then he has these ideal ideas, or the Neoplatonists are there, and I think we're talking about the Jew as well. I forget it.
Phil, are you talking about Philo of Alexandria?
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Philo the Jew. That's why I called him the Jew.
Yeah. But so many of our concepts of Christianity come directly from Philo. It's fascinating.
I agree too. At least that's what I get these feelings, but I'm not an expert, so I like it when you guys show up and say, yeah, Phil, you were catching the drift of that.
There's a growing number of scholars who are arguing now, mainly in Northwest Europe, similar to the minimalist school for the Old Testament, but these New Testament scholars are arguing for the Stoic influence or Greek philosophical influence on the New Testament and Paul. Paul's model of conversion, the idea that one is struck by a power above, who is the manifestation of the ultimate God, and then that power then brings that person into a new community, a new being, becomes a new creation. This is a very Stoic idea. It's an adaptation of the Stoic idea of the power of the Logos, or reason, and Yeah, well, I've posted on a lot of these things I've said, but so you can see some scholars certainly do see strong Stoic influences through the writings of Paul, and I've mentioned recently that in Matthew, some also see Matthew's adaptation of Mark as pulling Jesus' teaching in a Stoic direction.
Yeah.
You know, I just want to interrupt real fast and give a quick commercial for Vridar, because Neil and Tim have written about all these topics we've been discussing so far, and many, many more in great detail. So if your readers and listeners are interested in these topics, do yourself a favor and jump on that blog, because it is astoundingly good.
I agree. And let's pick up with Neil again. Do you believe there were pre-existing traditions or movements for John the Baptist, an apocalyptic tradition, and a Pentecostal-like spiritual possession tradition?
I don't know.
I'll repeat that. How about J the B? Do we think he had his own club?
I don't know. Make of it. I don't know if there was even a John the Baptist. I simply don't know what to make of it. The stories we have in the Gospels are clearly literary creations. I'm not saying there isn't an historical John the Baptist behind them. We simply don't have any evidence for that I'm aware of. The only John the Baptist in Josephus is much later than Jesus, and there are serious doubts about the authenticity of that passage. We can't just assume, rest on historicity on that questionable passage in Josephus. I mean, it might be legitimate, but there's not enough security there to know for sure.
Right.
Okay.
What Neil said. Wait. Let's not leave that too fast, because that's very well said. It wouldn't shock me if there was no John the Baptist, because if we take out that one passage in Josephus, then we have no better evidence for John the Baptist than we do Jesus. But there definitely was a separate rival to Christianity in John the Baptist's cult. And that's very fascinating to me to see how that was initially a rival. It shows up in all four Gospels as a rival to Jesus, and yet it gets co-opted and domesticated by early Christianity, and then we're supposed to expect that they were all friends right from the get-go. It's very Orwellian the way they put them into the fold.
Okay, then we're seeing a pre-existing tradition being absorbed by the Christian movement itself.
Right, or if not pre-Christian, certainly at around the same time as Christianity.
Okay.
And as Neil said, whether that meant there was a real John the Baptist behind it or not, that we don't know.
My take also is that the John the Baptist story in the Gospels really is based on the very traditional reiterative message of the Bible stories itself about Old Israel, New Israel. Old Israel. We always go through these. This is what Old Israel did back in the wilderness. This is what the new ones should do, and then they failed, and the new ones. And John the Baptist is really representing. He's a figure there who's representing the old way, and Jesus comes in as the new way. So there's a mythical understanding of his creation as he appears in the Gospels as well. So, but whether there was, as David said, there seems to emerge somewhere along the line of John the Baptist movement, but what that was, I don't know. James McGrath is a specialist in the Mandeans. He might be able to help us.
Yeah, maybe so. There's some also interesting things about that John the Baptist is a placeholder for Elijah, because that was meant to be a messianic trope. It was that there'd be a forebearer to it. Robert Price had an essay in, I believe it's in Problems with the Christ Myth, on is Jesus John the Baptist. We know that the Jesus in these gospel stories is an allegory. He posed the question, is he an allegory for John the Baptist? Which blew my mind. I thought it was ridiculous when I first heard it, and the more I thought about it, the more it's compelling. We don't have any way of knowing that's true, but there's lots of really interesting things about that. For instance, the first two Gospels in Luke, Jesus is inserted in those stories, and you can pluck him out with no problem, and it makes more sense. It's very clear to me, at least, that those two chapters in Luke where they're talking about John the Baptist, those came from scriptures about John the Baptist. Even when Mary is in there singing the Magnificat, that's based on Old Testament stories that reflect Elizabeth, her cousin's, John the Baptist's mother's condition, not Mary's condition.
Huh. Okay, and Neil, you've written about a Pentecostal-like spiritual possession tradition possibly existing. I'm a former Pentecostal, by the way.
Fun.
My take on that, it comes from the scholar Hangis or Hangis that I mentioned earlier. Yeah, it's fascinating. Earl Doherty and others have spoken about the very strong likelihood of there being visions. Even the historicists, Larry Hurtado, for example, speaks about, and Alan Siegel, they all speak about visions being at the foundation of the Christian movement. But no, when you go through Paul's letters, there seems to be more than just visions. He's also talking about glossolalia, and so that, you do wonder. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because that does bind a larger group into a community, and yeah.
Okay, now are we looking at the principle of divinization, where you're essentially taking on the form of the god, and you imitate the god, and that's how you get to rise from the grave like the god, if I understand the psychology?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pardon. Go right ahead, Neil. Pardon me.
No, sorry, that wasn't me. No, I'm fine.
I was just going to jump in and say that's true. And when you hear people who are describing their mystery faith gods, like Apuleius in Metamorphosis, when he talks about his savior god Isis, he sounds just like a Christian talking about his personal savior Jesus.
Huh. I'll be darned. Okay, now, is there any group of scholars more biased than biblical scholars?
Who are, do you say, more biased than biblical scholars?
Yes. Is there a group? I want to know where this group of scholars is at.
I have been very disappointed to discover, as I'm reading, that there seems to be a lot of the same willingness to believe, the naivety, the agendas amongst too many ancient historians. I see ancient historians complaining about that amongst their peers, but I'm quite sure it's not nearly as extensive as it is amongst biblical scholars themselves, most of whom came through as Christians from the beginning. So,
yeah, Hector Avalos points out in the Into Biblical Studies that even among secular biblical scholars, he can't think of any, I can't think of any, that didn't already come out of a religious background. So even the secular scholars, for the most part, are coming with huge amounts of baggage and presuppositions towards biblical studies. And the ones who are already working for Jesus, I mean, that's just out. I mean, we shouldn't ask, like, how many scholars are aboard with this theory. One thing we should ask is, how many of these biblical scholars are contractually obligated to not believe this theory?
Right. You've always said how hard it is to explain something to somebody when you're essentially talking them out of their paycheck.
Well, that's the quote I use in the book. It says it's hard to make a man believe something when his salary depends on him not believing it. Yeah.
That is if there's an eternal truth, Dave, I think you've just spoken it.
I think that was Upton Sinclair who said that, not me, but yeah, absolutely.
Okay, now is Jesus all of these things? The fallen temple, fallen Israel, and perhaps something of an excuse for the fallen Jehovah?
Well, here's the thing. He's all that and more, and he's more every day. I mean, if you don't believe in evolution, look at Christianity, because that thing is a Darwinian jungle on overdrive and has been for 2,000 years. It's still not finished mutating.
Yes, and yeah, that's really something. Well, that seems a great strength of Christianity, is you could take a group of people to an island, and with the Bible, you could form a society out of it. It's got all the thou shalt nots that you need.
Yep, and you probably wouldn't even recognize it as Christianity. The further we go back into early Christianity, the less we recognize it as anything that's Christian to us.
That's true. You guys want to talk about the Gnostics as we roll out of the show here? I want to thank you all for coming. Tell us about the Christian Gnostics. Maybe we should... Go ahead, Dave.
Me or Neil?
No, I was just going to mention. I was just going to say that a number of Jewish scholars are actually arguing that Christianity and Judaism did not really emerge as separate religions per se until 2-3 centuries, or not more than 2-3-4 centuries into the Christian era. So yeah, it's quite a different history from what we see today about the nature of Christianity then.
Neil, can we say that there is no resurrection in Codices Sinaiticus and Vaticanus that were used to create the Vulgate? Because if I recall, the short version of Mark has someone saying that Jesus, he's not in the tomb, that he's gone ahead to Jerusalem.
The story, with the short ending of Mark, where we don't meet resurrected Jesus, we simply hear about him, that he's gone ahead to meet the disciples in Galilee. That's the way that's told is very similar to the way other mythical stories of persons coming back from the dead or going on to heaven are told. Heracles, for example, simply disappears, and we're told that he's now gone to some other place. And Theseus, yes,
like Romulus.
This is just the way it was told. And then
Romulus, Apollonius, Diana. We hear these same things, the same tropes.
Yeah, people. Yeah, no. What the standard trope for a resurrection wasn't so much a resurrection of the body; it was simply an empty tomb, and then hearing or meeting the God, the person later on. The tomb is empty that's really a symbolic thing. No one knows really what happened to the body; it just sort of vanishes out of consciousness, essentially. Yeah. Yeah. It's a sign that the person has gone on, to a higher place.
Right, just like King Arthur, one future king. You can see these ideas getting rehashed and recycled over and over again.
Yeah. No, the idea of then you see the development through the Gospels of Jesus becoming more visible, more touchable. Having a real presence after the resurrection. That's a later development, and that seems to coincide with various conflicts with Gnostics, Docetism, and so on.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you tons for coming today. Now, there's one last thing, and this is very important. I've been very impressed by the work of Hector Avalos recently.
Absolutely.
Then, okay, he's now going to be the 6th person I'm adding that Nuskeptix endorses. Nice. Okay? So we specialize in Christ myth, and then we're doing a lot of other things online as well with the skeptic community. So I want to thank you, gentlemen. We're going to be doing some science in the future, and everybody. So check us out online. Bye.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
Woohoo.
Okay, we're offline.